I'm grateful to all of you for your interest in this topic and the chance to be here with you today. I have some opening remarks and a few slides just to keep you entertained with some photos or graphics and only a very few words. And I look forward to taking the conversation wherever you'd like to take it. If you're particularly interested in this topic, I'm drawing heavily on a paper that I prepared last summer. I left the Pentagon a year ago today. It's been a very good, relaxing year. I like to say that I rediscovered my sleep cycle and sense of humor, both of them. And I think they had both disappeared by that point. But along the way, before going to Stanford, I took a fellowship at the Institute of the Japanese Ministry of Defense to assist in their thinking about how the future of the extended deterrence and strategic stability topic in Northeast Asia. So there's an unclassified paper published online at their website, the National Institute for Defense Studies. And I'm drawing on that today, but we'll talk a little more broadly. Since one of you walked off with the clicker, I have to do this from up here. So forgive me for standing here, and these are just a few graphics to keep you entertained while I say a few things. Why are we even talking about extended deterrence and strategic stability at a time when the American president is committed to the vision, the Prague Agenda, the practical matter of taking concrete steps towards the long-term goal of the elimination of nuclear weapons? Well, this is in part a reflection of where the president came from. Recall that he gave the speech in Prague and 3 weeks later was sent a little thank you note by North Korea, which was the underground test of one of their nuclear devices, which followed quickly their test of one of their space launch vehicles. And within a matter of about 24 hours, President Obama had a couple of telephone calls from the leaders of Japan and South Korea, who, in my paraphrasing language, said, Mr. President, lovely speech in Prague, and really, if there's anything we can do to advance the non-proliferation part of your agenda, that would make a concrete difference in our security environment, so please let us know what we can do. That was part of the pathway to South Korea becoming the host of the second Nuclear Security Summit. But, Mr. President, in your rush to zero, are you going to close what's left of the nuclear umbrella? And this came as something of a surprise to the White House, and it led to guidance to the nuclear posture review process to examine seriously what could be done to strengthen extended deterrence and the assurance of our allies. And this emerged in the report as one of the main themes. The verb was carefully debated. Was it strengthen or just preserve extended deterrence and assurance of allies? And the verb that was chosen was strengthen, out of the sense that this is what the security environment today requires. I want to point out a basic connection between the extended deterrence strategic stability topic and the long-term pathway to zero. If we were to fail at the project of extended deterrence in this security environment, what would that mean? There are two objects of extended deterrence policy. One is the party you're trying to deter, and one is the party you're trying to assure. If we fail at the deterrence part of that equation, it's likely that we would see other challengers emerge who would be emboldened by the perception that the U.S. security guarantees are no longer credible. We would also have allies react to the perception that the U.S. guarantees are no longer credible. And thus we could see one of the nuclear tipping points or two nuclear tipping points crossed if there were to be a failure of the extended deterrence project in the security environment. And there's an analogous argument about strategic stability. If we fail to find a stable strategic relationship with Russia and China, and we fall into a more competitive set of strategic military relationships, a renewal of arms racing, then we are very unlikely to find that Russia and China are willing to work more closely with us on nonproliferation, and certainly the prospect for nuclear reductions by the three in some fashion becomes more remote. So if you're a president committed to the Prague agenda, you have to get this part of the equation right. It's not a particularly popular piece of work that we carried on, but this was challenging and interesting work, and I'd like to give you a sense of it. In the course of the nuclear posture review, following on the President's guidance to look for options for strengthening extended deterrence, we conducted consultations. This was the third nuclear posture review since the end of the Cold War. Each administration has done one. The first two NPRs were done without any consultations at all outside the U.S. government. And indeed, the first was done without any consultations across the river. It was just done by the Pentagon. And we thought this was a bad way to get a start. Obviously, there are lots of stakeholders in America's nuclear posture and policy and strategy. And so my door was thrown open as the co-director of the Nuclear Posture Review, and we conducted approximately 70 meetings with approximately 35 different countries over the course of the review. Along the way, we discovered that many allies are perceive themselves to be safe, secure, and ready to for the United States to take additional steps in partnership with Russia to significantly reduce strategic stockpiles. But we found the United States has approximately 40 allies in 3 different regions, and we found approximately a dozen of those to be anxious. Anxious about deterrence generally, anxious about changes in the security environment, anxious about the credibility of the United States as a security guarantor, anxious about what the United States was going to do with the nuclear umbrella. And 2 of these are in Northeast Asia. Japan and South Korea are both anxious on all of those scores. And we had extensive consultations with both of them early in the administration. And they both used a verb we Americans don't use. They wanted to know what we were going to do to ensure that we could re-extend nuclear deterrence on their behalf. We said, wait a minute, we're extending nuclear deterrence every day. The triads out there can deliver a nuclear weapon anywhere in the world within 30 minutes in defense of any interest of the United States or an ally. Isn't that an active nuclear umbrella? No, is the common view. The common view is, at the end of the Cold War, the nuclear umbrella in Northeast Asia got folded up and taken home. Presidential nuclear initiatives, unilateral reciprocal informal measures adopted at the end of the Cold War, all American nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula, all American nuclear weapons on naval surface vessels came home. And the authors of the nuclear posture reviews of 1994 and 2001 said to the Japanese and South Koreans, we are keeping, for you, nuclear-armed Tomahawk cruise missiles. And we're going to keep them in storage, and if we ever find ourselves in a crisis again where there's some nuclear issue, we can redeploy these if it comes to it. So the lesson that the Japanese and South Koreans took was America had folded its nuclear umbrella, put it in the bin outside the door, and at some point in a future crisis, we'd go retrieve it and bring it back. That's a very fundamentally different perception. Some of you have probably seen this picture. It was just about a year ago that the North Korean leadership began making big threats to Japan and South Korea. And if you know about this picture, the map on the back wall is a map of the trajectories of different types of North Korean missiles into the continental United States. This is, I refer to this as the Austin, Texas map. Austin, Texas is one of the cities that's designated as an aim point for North Korean nuclear missiles. Now, we tend to kind of sneer at this and say this is propaganda. There was a lot of propaganda issued by the North Korean government at the time. There was the video some of you may have seen, young North Korean man asleep, dreaming of the nuclear bombs coming across to Manhattan, the incineration, the fires, the firestorms, and he wakes up a happy individual. That was part of the background to the U.S. decision to display some nuclear capability by flying bombers into the region. As propaganda, it's a little, they may not appreciate that we think the big hats look really silly. This doesn't scare us very much, but it points to the capabilities that North Korea has put in place or is putting in place. And we can debate when exactly and precisely what kind of capabilities. But for a long time, they've talked about having the ability to threaten by nuclear means South Korea, American bases in South Korea and across the region, including in Japan. They've talked about threatening Japan as such. They've talked about reaching Guam, reaching Hawaii, reaching the missile defense base in Alaska, and ultimately, of course, the American homeland. Sooner or later, if not already, they will put all of this together, and this presents a significant new strategic problem for extended deterrence. It's one thing to extend deterrence when the American homeland is not vulnerable, and when American bases in the region are not vulnerable, and it's quite different when they are. And this is as much an assurance problem as a deterrence problem. And by that I mean the Japanese and South Koreans very much worry about an old Cold War term, decoupling. The theory in the Cold War was that the Soviets would be able to keep America from coming to Europe's defense because they could put the American homeland vulnerable. And the Japanese have discovered this, and the South Koreans, this decoupling logic, and say if there's ever a crisis involving the North Koreans, they now have the ability to scare you enough that you're not going to come to our defense. So there's the decoupling problem that's presented today, but in a new form. And to invoke another Cold War set of concepts, the stability-instability paradox. And presumably some of you will have read about this, but this is fundamentally the idea that if two nations are in conflict, both acquire nuclear weapons, they both feel they have trump cards, and one believes, well, I got a trump card in my pocket, so that I can cause a whole lot of trouble for this guy. Think Mumbai. And of course, the Japanese and South Koreans don't think Mumbai. They think the sinking of the Chonan, the firing, the artillery fire on the islands, and see North Korea as emboldened under its new nuclear umbrella to conduct provocations at the conventional level right up to the brink of war. So this is a familiar looking problem, but it comes to us in a new guise in a very different strategic landscape. This is a crummy PowerPoint version of a map that hangs on the wall behind the desk of the policy director in the Japanese Ministry of Defense. And if you can't quite see it, it's the East Asian coast, the Chinese coast on the bottom, with Japan here, the Sakhalin Islands up here, Southeast Asia, Indonesia. And if this is a quick way to make a point about the Japanese worldview. The South Koreans don't worry about China from the perspective of our extended deterrence posture. The Japanese do. The Japanese feel under the thumb of China. They feel the pressure of China's modernization. They feel the pressure of China's grievances about the past. They feel the pressure that they are not the Japanese, are not dynamic economically or politically in the way the Chinese are. And this is their kind of worldview. And by the way, where's America on this map? Somewhere over the horizon. Where's Guam? It's there, but it's vulnerable. And so the Japanese have particular concerns additional to the ones about North Korea. Their concerns relate to also decoupling and the stability-instability paradox, to go back to that language. The Japanese believe that once China gains, or more precisely, now that China has gained confidence in the credibility of its secure retaliatory capability through its modernization program, it's able to put the American homeland credibly at risk, and therefore the Japanese worry that we will be scared away in time of crisis. They also see the stability-instability paradox at work. The Japanese Defense White Paper of 3 years ago refers to China in terms of the challenge it posed for creeping international expansionism. The Japanese White Paper of last summer talks about China as a country that has succeeded in using force to change the status quo. So the Japanese leadership perception of China today is that its behavior has changed, and that its behavior has changed because of developments in its strategic military posture. Now, I don't want to overemphasize the particular capabilities that are in place in either North Korea or China, because these will continue to evolve over time. We put a lot of emphasis in our study of proliferation on systems and technologies that proliferate. I'd like you also to think about ideas that proliferate. These countries, North Korea, China, and elsewhere in the world, Iran and Russia, have a common strategic problem, which is us. They worry that in America, committed to unipolarity, hegemonic behavior, driven by values to use force in defense of our values, in support of our values, and motivated by the Joint Vision 2020 vision. Now, what is that? The Joint Vision 2020 document was written by the Pentagon in the 90s and then again updated in the early 2000s, and it's a vision of what the future U.S. military force should look like. And it says that America should be able to dominate combat in all domains, domain dominance, and we should enjoy freedom from attack and freedom to attack. This is a wonderful vision if you're a military planner, and it just sends chills up and down your spine if you're in Beijing or Moscow. And these four countries have to worry that America is going to come knocking with all of its conventional military capability, all of its nuclear superiority, probably a large coalition and a bunch of allies. And so they have a common strategic problem, which is how to motivate us not to come knocking, or if we do, how to motivate us to stop short of doing grievous damage to their most vital interests. And the North Koreans and the Chinese are probably the most explicit, and Jeffrey's done some of the best work on this, about how they think about countering our deterrence strategies. We project power, their response is to escalate or not. We want to deter them from escalating. We want to coerce them out of the fight. And they've thought about that problem very hard, and they put in place a lot of capability and strategy and doctrine, and they exercise it. And my point is North Korea and Russia and maybe Iran have thought similarly about this problem and in similar ways are implementing ideas. And fundamentally, it seems to me that they are pursuing nuclear blackmail strategies, not nuclear warfighting strategies. These countries can't expect to fight and win a nuclear war against America. But they might be able to believe that they can coerce us in ways that are helpful to them And this is just a simple model to illustrate what I think is a big emerging strategic problem. The left axis is escalation, both vertical and horizontal. 3 categories of conflicts or decision points in here. At the low end, what the Japanese white paper calls gray zone conflicts. Think senkakus, think shelling of the island by the North Koreans. But where our deterrence objectives are try to persuade them not to do these things, and certainly not to escalate out of them into a conventional campaign of some kind. At the very high end is the challenge of deterring nuclear attacks on the American homeland. This is not a new problem, but it is new when it comes to North Korea. And in the middle is this red zone. We don't know how big it is, but it's the space that seems to be opening up as countries like North Korea acquire what they might believe to be a trump card that gives them some freedom of maneuver to do things in a regional war that would cross our nuclear declaratory policy red lines, but where we might choose not to employ nuclear weapons in response. Our historical way of thinking about this, and by that I mean the ideas that developed in the early 1990s as a result of our first encounter with this kind of problem with Saddam Hussein. We largely understood that Saddam's, perhaps misunderstood, but what we understood at the time was that Saddam's nuclear weapons, if there were any, would be there for regime survival purposes. That essentially there'd be a long conventional war, and then then Baghdad would be at risk. Saddam would use nuclear weapons. That would be the exclamation point on the end of the war over. This is a more complicated picture. It suggests that North Korea might believe that there are ways to employ nuclear weapons or other kinds of capabilities that would threaten our vital interests or South Korea's or Japan's, but believe that he's not risking retaliation or substantial retaliation because he can put the American homeland at risk. This is a different strategic problem from the one we've thought about before. My one big word chart. This is, because this is a complex topic, I want to be sure that you all can just digest it. But so if that's the emerging strategic problem that we think we face in ensuring that extended deterrence is credible and effective in the 21st century, this is not a problem that we want to meet first and foremost with nuclear weapons. There are multiple tools for extended deterrence and for the assurance of our allies. And the Obama administration set out this comprehensive approach in the Quadrennial Defense Review, and the Nuclear Posture Review, and the Ballistic Missile Defense Review, and the like. All of these different elements contribute something to deterrence. We don't see a need to increase the role of nuclear weapons in this overall strategy, because we think there's increased deterrence value from some of these other capabilities. Ballistic missile defense, for example, just by way of illustration. If it's true that North Korean leaders would pursue in time of war a nuclear brinksmanship strategy, which might be, here's one nuclear weapon, and if you don't now sue for peace on our term, there's a threat of more to come. If we can effectively take that cheap shot off the table, if North Korea can't get away with just firing one, but has to fire 10 or 20 or 30 to get one through, well, that's not brinksmanship, firing 30 nuclear weapons at South Korea or the United States. That's war, big time war. And the nuclear deterrent ought to be relevant to that problem. So I'm just trying to illustrate the point that there are deterrence contributions by all of these different capabilities. The sixth element here reflects the fact that, bear in mind that we're trying to strengthen regional deterrence architectures in 3 different regions: Northeast Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. And so in each of those regions, the nuclear aspect that we contribute as the security guarantor differs for historical reasons, for strategic reasons, for reasons of geography, and the like. So we have tried to tailor the nuclear component in each case. There was a lot of tailoring of the nuclear component to this strategy in the context of the nuclear posture review vis-a-vis Northeast Asia. We deliberated changes to U.S. nuclear declaratory policy in light of what we understood to be the interests of our allies in Northeast Asia. It would have been very difficult to say to South Korea that we weren't going to think anymore about the possible employment of a nuclear weapon to deter chemical and biological attack at a time when there's still good evidence that North Korea is actively engaged in preparing for chemical and biological warfare. We also did some tailoring when it came to the topic of nuclear-armed cruise missiles. As I said, the leaders of the first two nuclear posture reviews said these were for our allies in Northeast Asia. Well, and then they put them in nice storage sheds somewhere, and they got older and older. They were already old in 1994, and they got much older. And we as an administration faced a choice about modernizing them or retiring, replacing them or retiring. This was a highly sensitive topic from the perspective of the Japanese and South Koreans, because to them it sounded like we might retire their umbrella. And the result of the policy review was that we would modernize another capability, the other capability to forward deploy nuclear weapons without strategic delivery systems. And those are the dual capable fighters that are associated with the B-61 bombs that remain in Europe. In Europe, we removed 95% of the nuclear weapons that were there that the US fielded into Europe during the Cold War. 95% gone, 5% left. The exact number is a classified number, but you can all find it on your websites. The countries where they're located are classified. I can't say them, but you can find all that on your websites. We faced the decision of modernizing both of these capabilities and said we didn't need them both. That fundamentally, the dual capable aircraft could serve the same purpose in Northeast Asia that they serve in Europe. And in fact, the Obama administration committed to maintaining a, quote, globally deployable force of nuclear weapons with non-strategic delivery systems. Now, why? Many people have recommended that these old weapons in Europe are just Cold War relics. Soviet Union's gone, Cold War's over. What's the point of keeping these things? Why not bring them home? Any target we might strike with them, we can get with a strategic system. What's the point? The allies in Northeast Asia answer that question with two answers. One, best illustrated by a South Korean reaction to the bomber flyby a year ago. So remember, in response to all that bluff and belligerence, in went these bombers. And this was largely intended for assurance, not deterrence messages. And the one South Korean, senior South Korean said to me, "These are great. These displays are great for displaying your American resolve." That's only part of the problem. If there were really a crisis underway in which North Korea is threatening nuclear employment, part of what they're going to be trying to do is separate the United States from its allies. They're going to be testing our collective resolve and our South Korean resolve. Your bombers are great for displaying your resolve. How do they display South Korean resolve? How do they display our combined intention to stand tough in the face of these nuclear-backed threats that we're getting? You've solved that problem in Europe, according to NATO, by having these nuclear sharing arrangements. Well, we South Koreans don't expect to share nuclear missions with you, But we think having an ability that can be deployed into our territory in time of war, where we run the risk with you because it's fielded on our territory, this would be a very powerful deterrence message back to the North. So that's one argument they make. The other argument they make is, now if we actually ever cross the nuclear threshold and choose to employ nuclear weapons against North Korea, with the hope that this will stop the conflict, we don't want them to retaliate, and we certainly don't want them to retaliate on the American homeland. So here's your American choice. You shoot at them with a nuclear weapon that's in the region, or you shoot at them with a nuclear weapon that's in the American homeland. Which makes it easier for them to retaliate onto the United States? Wouldn't you really rather that the North Korean leadership thought it was a really big step to fire a nuclear weapon back onto the American homeland? These are two good arguments. They weren't exactly felicitous to the ears of the Obama administration, but it's part of the reason we ended up where we did. The paper that I referenced that's online, the last third of the paper is really a discussion about going forward on these issues. What are the issues with Japan? And there are similar issues with South Korea. What's interesting about our extended deterrence strategy today in comparison to the past is that allies contribute a lot. I mean, in the Cold War, extended deterrence was provided by the United States with a nuclear umbrella. In this security environment, there's nothing here that's only America's job. So some of the most interesting discussions today inside the alliances are about, for example, number 3. Japan is our most important partner in operating and developing ballistic missile defenses. We, with Japan, are developing an advanced missile defense interceptor, which will become available later in the decade. That interceptor will notionally have some capability against China's missiles. Should Japan deploy it? If so, in what numbers? This is a whole new set of questions that aren't raised by the missile defenses that are in place that don't have capability against China. Number 4, we Americans have been talking about having some long-range, non-nuclear, prompt strike capability ever since 1988. And we've done a lot of talk and spent a lot of money and have nothing to show for it. It's still pretty clear that in the eyes of most of us, if we were actually in an escalating conflict on the Korean Peninsula, our threat to strike first with a conventional weapon at long range would be more credible in our eyes than a threat to strike first with a nuclear weapon. As one South Korean put it, you're not going to be the only country twice to have fired nuclear weapons at little brown people in East Asia. A political fact. Now, as we don't fill this gap in the deterrence posture, allies want to. South Koreans have pushed very hard. Some of you must work on missile technology control regime issues. You would know that the United States sponsored South Korea into MTCR about a dozen years ago under a special provision where they were constrained, they in particular were constrained from developing missiles that could reach North Korea, all of North Korea. They pushed for relief from this. Because if we're not going to have conventional strike capabilities, ballistic missile against North Korean capabilities, why shouldn't they? Well, naturally enough, what's the next question? It's in Japan. Why doesn't Japan have this capability too? And of course, Japan acquiring conventionally armed ballistic missiles capable of reaching North Korea, well, that means those missiles could also reach bits of China, bits of Russia, by the way, and all of South Korea. Politically, a very fraught question. Lastly, there's a lot of debate about number 6 here. Is more tailoring required to adjust the nuclear posture to the new realities of the security environment? And there are a lot of voices in both Japan and South Korea for further changes. particularly South Korea. Right? The Japanese debate isn't, there's no Japanese appetite for nuclear weapons, there's no Japanese appetite for bringing US nuclear weapons into their territory, except perhaps in war. And we had a Japanese foreign minister make that point 10 days ago. The Japanese debate is about that NATO thing you got, that NATO model. Why wouldn't that be right for us? Well, they don't quite understand the NATO model, but what they mean is, if the American president ever has to use a nuclear weapon on behalf of a commitment to a NATO ally, the NATO allies have a seat at the table. They don't have a finger on the button, but NATO has the nuclear planning group, it's got the high-level group to develop policy in this area. There's no nuclear planning group with Japan, there's no high-level group with Japan. So how do they get a seat at the table if the American president's ever going to make such a momentous decision on their behalf? That's a good and logical question. The South Koreans, as you would know, are having a much wider-ranging debate about the effectiveness of the U.S. nuclear umbrella and the potential desirability of nuclear weapons of their own. And here on this, public opinion polling is very clear and very consistent increase. It hasn't spiked up and down. 20-year increase to above 70% today, public support for either the reintroduction of U.S. nuclear weapons or South Korea's acquisition of its own nuclear weapons. And when you've got people thinking that, you can be sure that there are going to be politicians reacting to that and trying to shape and lead that. So there is one presidential candidate in South Korea who's running on a platform that calls for acquiring nuclear weapons. To advance our cooperation with South Korea and Japan, to sustain the dialogues that we began in the Nuclear Posture Review, we built mechanisms a little bit like the NATO high-level group. With Japan, we built something called the Extended Deterrence Dialogue, which it was my pleasure to co-chair on the US side. And with South Korea, something called the Extended Deterrence Policy Committee. These bodies have three main functions, four functions. The first is to meet twice a year and have good times while doing it, build teams. But seriously, continued transparency on policy and strategy. How do we see the world? What are we trying to do? Does Japan need conventional strike? What about that missile defense for China, et cetera, et cetera? Another function is to think through some problems together. We actually sit together in rooms like this and do tabletop exercises, thinking through possible scenarios with North Korea. This has been utterly path-breaking for Japan and South Korea, who have never engaged in that kind of work at the official level. And lastly, a function of these groups is to give these allies the kind of experience that our NATO allies have had, hands-on, the capabilities that we provide for them, for their defense. NATO allies regularly see U.S. nuclear deterrent forces. The Japanese and South Koreans had never seen any of them. So these dialogues have convened at Strategic Command in Omaha. We took the Japanese to an ICBM base in Montana. They've also been to the naval base at Bangor, where the SSBNs are located. South Koreans have been to Los Alamos and some other places. So these dialogues are very high content, very interesting. These two allies are the demandeurs, and we, the United States, are doing very well just to sort of stay in the game with them.
Great. Are you going to be able to wrap up pretty soon? Because I want to make sure that you've raised so many issues that we have plenty of time for.
I'm going to speed. I probably have 7 to 10 more minutes of comments. Will that work?
It will have to.
It will. I just want to make. I've talked a little bit about the NATO context, but I wanted you to. It's a different conceptual map. NATO is an alliance without enemies. NATO is an alliance without enemies. It believes that it should be a nuclear alliance so long as nuclear weapons remain. It doesn't maintain any nuclear plans against any country. but it maintains an ability to plan nuclear war. How does it do that? It creates a world map that has no Middle East, no Africa, but there are some island countries that are enemies. And there's a large Atlantis off to the northwest there, beyond the UK, that presents the challenges of a large neighboring adversarial nuclear-armed country. But American extended deterrence policy and assurance strategy needs to be effective in both of these regions, two very different kinds of challenges. The Northeast Asian allies watch this like hawks. The NATO allies barely even know that there's a Northeast Asia. But the Japanese and South Koreans watch the debate in NATO about America's credibility as a guarantor. They watch the debate about nuclear weapons, and they watch decisions about dual-capable aircraft, as if their security depended on it. This is a quick map to introduce the topic of strategic stability with China. Here we are in the business of trying to strengthen extended deterrence, which involves the creation and display of force, among other things. At the same time, we're trying to not antagonize the neighboring major power in Northeast Asia, while also wanting to be able to deter it from doing things at the conventional level of war, where it seems to be testing some of the rules. I've had the good benefit to participate in a lot of Track 2 dialogues with the Chinese. Was in Beijing in November. Our team met with the Deputy Chief of Staff of the military, the PLA, and he said, "Why should you be worried about China's rise? We, after all, are just a trading nation. We built the Silk Road." This is a map. This is purposely a photograph from a museum in Beijing, because this history is present in their strategic worldview. We're traders. D-E-R-S, traders. We built the Silk Road. We sent our vessels out there in the 15th century to we're explorers. We're benign. Why would you have an issue with us? And these were words directly from the deputy. And we, the Obama administration, said about strategic stability with China, we value it, we're not going to define it. The reason we're not going to define it is we want a dialogue with China about it. And we're not going to give away the house in the absence of dialogue. Now, Presidents Clinton and Bush both had agreements with their Chinese counterparts to begin a dialogue on nuclear issues, and the total result of that was a 1-hour discussion in the Pentagon in 2007. The Chinese have not been willing to engage us in this discussion of strategic stability, the Obama administration. They do have a simple question. Do you Americans accept mutual vulnerability as the basis of the strategic relationship with China in the way that you do with Russia? Because if you don't, we got a peck of trouble, and if you do, we're fine, goes their argument. We haven't said. The Japanese have said, boy, you better not say that. Because if you say to the Chinese that you accept mutual vulnerability as the basis of the strategic relationship, you will have confirmed their success in building a relationship of mutual deterrence with you, and they will expect that in a coming confrontation in the conventional domain, you will stay home. How can that be stable? And I can give that in my short remaining time as the summary, because that's that's not just the summary, that's the current state of play of talking with China about strategic stability. Schelling's view, by the way, written down about a year ago in a book on strategic stability at low numbers. He wrote the preface. He said, don't be in such a rush to define this. You know, in the Cold War, it took us 12 years to get some notion of what strategic stability ought to mean. And that was such a simple world compared to this world. Spend some time to figure this out. Do your homework. It'll take a couple of decades at least. So, 2 more slides. simple point. On extended deterrence, we've sort of come full circle. The early nuclear era was all about extended deterrence. Central deterrence emerged as a strategic problem in the 1960s. We were first putting nuclear weapons in Europe and then in East Asia to encircle the Soviet Union as a part of our containment strategy. Now extended, and at the end of the Cold War, for most Americans interested in nuclear things, extended deterrence went away as an important topic. But it's back, and it's back in a very different way, in a very different strategic landscape. Final slide. So in my first week at Stanford, I opened up the lovely available newspaper, the San Francisco Chronicle, and there is in the travel section, a wonderful story about atomic tourism. And I failed to clip the article, and I can't find it now because it's the perfect headline. It's the perfect summary of how we Americans think about the nuclear problem today. The nuclear problem today is kind of an interesting footnote to the Cold War, a scary historical vestige, but these are Cold War relics. We don't need to work this problem very hard. It's tourism. This is, and it's a little salacious, a little embarrassing, but it's the past. And we're coming into a time when, one of Jeffrey's students is about to give a paper on for Pony on how much we're going to spend on might or might not spend on nuclear modernization. We are coming into the United States in the Cold War spent approximately 1 of every 4 defense dollars on nuclear stuff. Since 1991, we haven't had to spend pretty much anything. We're living off of investments made in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. And if we're going to stay in this business over the next 2 decades, we have to replace every single delivery system and extend the life of every single warhead in the arsenal. This will be very expensive. Will it be affordable? Well, that's a political question. And just to stick to my main point here about extended deterrence and strategic stability, from the perspective of our allies in Northeast Asia, if we conclude that it's too expensive for us to modernize dual-capable aircraft and provide the B-61 bomb, and to maintain an overall force structure that's bigger than China's, these 2 allies are primed to conclude that America is not just getting out of the nuclear business. America is simply not keeping up with what you have to do to be the world's only superpower in the 21st century. And they will hedge more and more in the direction of moving their own way down this pathway. So with that, let me thank you for your attention and welcome the conversation wherever it takes us.
Thank you so much, Brad. This was I think, both a fascinating and